Good evening and welcome to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates, a platform to deliberate the challenges this region will face in the 21st century. I'm Brendan Fernandez and I'm your moderator. Tonight's topic is religious fundamentalism is a threat to Asia's future. The motion states that religious fundamentalism, whether a political ideology garbed in religious terminology or a religious movement defining itself largely or entirely by religious values, poses a threat to our region. This is a burning issue, and we have a distinguished panel of speakers flown in from around the region to analyze all the hidden nuances and ramifications of what is known as religious fundamentalism today. In our audience today, we have stakeholders, academics, thinkers, and business people. Earlier, we polled them to find out what their stand on this issue is. Currently, 78.6% agree with the motion and 21.4% are against it. When the debate begins, we'll be doing another poll to see if the audience opinion has shifted. Let's now welcome our panelists. Speaking for the opposition, we have Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO which seeks to critique global injustice and develop an alternative vision of just and compassionate civilization. Welcome. Joining him, Dr. Farish Ahmad Noor, Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, where he is also part of the research cluster Transnational Religion in Southeast Asia. Welcome. Please welcome the team proposing tonight's motion. First, Mr. Sean Levine, lead expert on political and business trends in Indonesia and Malaysia at Eurasia Group. And Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, eminent columnist and political analyst. Welcome, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your panel for the debate motion, Religious Fundamentalism is a Threat to Asia's Future. Each panelist will now be given 1 minute to state their case. The proposition will start based on the coin that we tossed earlier. So, Mr. Sean Levine, your 1 minute begins now.
Rising religious fundamentalism is a risk to stability in Asia. The core belief of fundamentalism is to resist societal and political change, adhering to a literal interpretation of religion, either based in reality or in a belief of a previous golden age, whether real or imagined. These beliefs often run counter to the state and market intrusions into daily life, where the fundamentalist movement believes that the role is to protect the social order from modernization and secularization, often reacting to the marginalization of religion within a society. Fundamentalist movements can cause rifts in society, especially if there are attempts to impose their beliefs on other groups, either through legal or extrajudiciary means, such as the creation of morality police or the imposition of beliefs on a greater society. While not inherently violent, these movements can lead to violence within society if the government does not allow the political space for these groups to express their beliefs or reacts aggressively towards these movements. There also exists the opportunity for counter-movements within society.
Thank you very much. Now from the opposition, Professor Chandra Muzaffar, your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. It is not the terrorism or extremism or the ideology associated with a fringe within a community that should be allowed to define the character of that religion or the orientation of its followers. What determines the character of a religion or the community associated with that religion is the orientation, the behavior, the attitudes of the vast majority who constitute the mainstream in that particular religious community. And if you go on that basis, the vast majority of Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, and followers of other religions, they believe in leading peaceful lives and they have adjusted to the modern world.
Thank you very much. And from the proposition, Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, your 1 minute begins now.
I think I agree with Dr. Muzaffar when he says that we shouldn't confuse religion with religious fundamentalism. And I think that's precisely the point we have to make. That there is something called religion, which talks about an ethical basis of society, and there is something called religious fundamentalism. And what are the main features of this fundamentalism? First, that there is no historical context, that everything is timeless. Second, they have this notion that scriptures must be read literally and not as parables, which causes enormous confusion, which causes distortions. And thirdly, the most dangerous view, that our conviction is superior to anyone else's conviction, and therefore we have the right to resist that conviction. It is that intolerance which is really causing a potential threat to Asia today.
Thank you. And from the opposition, Dr. Farish Ahmad Noor, your 1 minute begins now.
I think we ought to place this debate in the context where the question arises, which is Asia. And Asia, since the end of World War II, has experienced the rise of the modern state. So when we talk about religious fundamentalism, the way that we seem to have defined it today for our discussion, we are really talking about a phenomenon that has, on the one hand, a religious dimension to it, but crucially, a political dimension to it as well. So, again, reiterating Chandra's point earlier, we need to maintain this distinction. It's both an ethical and analytic distinction between religion per se and instances where religion has been clearly instrumentalized for political reasons. And if we look at the instances of religious violence or religiously inspired violence in many parts of Asia in the 20th century, we'll see that behind these actors and agents, there have always been political and economic agendas at work as well. That, for me, is the real issue.
Thank you. Does religious fundamentalism strictly define merely being going back to the fundamentals of a faith? Or is it a response to our modern society, which has become a complex structure of relationships and ideas, and an attempt to hold on to certain elements in which one's faith are seen as immutable? Our eminent panelists will be debating this today. Now, throughout the course of this debate, you, the studio audience, can post questions to our panelists. We'll be taking some of the questions later during question time. The poll is also ongoing. You can vote on which side presents the more convincing argument. We'll be tracking the poll through the course of this show. Currently, the results stand at 33.3% agree with the motion and 66.7% disagree. Up next, your stand. Each panelist is given 3 minutes to argue and expand on their point. The proposition began earlier, so now let's have the opposition to start. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, if you are ready, your 3 minutes begins now.
Thank you. If I may elaborate on a couple of points which we have made and respond to some of the arguments on the other side. Now, if you look at the concrete situation in Asia, look at the most brutal, the most heinous crimes against humanity, if you like, that have taken place in this continent since the Second World War. They have not been associated with religion per se. Look at what happened in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge genocide. Look at what happened in Indonesia, the Gestapo incident. It was political. If you look at what had happened in Vietnam, 3 million people killed. It was again politics, imperialism. These were the forces at work, not religion as such. So if you look at the culpability of religion, you'll begin to wonder whether religion has really been the cause of the bloodshed, the turmoil, the turbulence that we have seen in so much of Asia. So while we agree that extremist interpretations of religion can be a problem, we should first try to understand why there are such extremist interpretations, the underlying causes, which very often are not linked to an interpretation of the text. It's not linked to doctrine as such. It's because of political, economic, and social circumstances. And at the same time, we should look at the total situation and say, look, what is really happening? We have had greater challenges emanating from other sources. And if I'm asked, I would say that a conflict between China and the United States of America poses a much greater threat to Asia in the coming years. Militarization of Asia is a much greater threat. The growing disparities between rich and poor in Asia is a great threat. Corruption is a great threat. Now, these are the real threats that we should be concerned about, rather than being fixated, focused upon a reaction to a situation, which is what religious fundamentalism is, the type of religious fundamentalism the opposition has talked about, the proposition has talked about. It's basically a reaction in many instances. So let's not get carried away by this. Let's focus on what is real, and that is what really counts in determining the future of this continent.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And now from the proposition, Mr. Sean Levine, if you're ready, your 3 minutes begins now.
Thank you. Yeah, I think to start, we have to understand also the definition of stability and what we're talking about when we say stability or the threat to stability from rising religious fundamentalism. Stability doesn't necessarily have to mean an imposition of violence or the possibility of violence against other groups or within a state. So I think it's important to understand that stability could also mean the erosion of harmony or the erosion of peace within a society or a civilization or within one particular country itself. And with the core belief of religious fundamentalism, being that the fundamentalists feel that the current political structure or the current societal or cultural structure does not fit into their beliefs, competition with the state is inevitable. It doesn't necessarily mean that the religious fundamentalists must control the government, nor does it mean that they must act violently against the government. So it's not inherently violent. However, there is this desire to take control or to influence the government in order to progress their beliefs that they have. This concept of a new system must challenge or must contest an existing system. The rise of religious fundamentalism in Asia often has the effect of heightening cleavages in society between cultural, religious, and ethnic groups. Instability can occur as well in the state reaction to such religious fundamentalism, the violent reaction, for example, in an attempt to marginalize the movement, or a violent reaction in an attempt to provoke equal reaction from the movement itself in order to further marginalize the movement itself, as well as counter movements from other ethnic, religious, or societal groups. This is also heightened in a lot of respects in countries with a weaker rule of law, for example, or a government that has failed to support civil society, either through education, through poverty eradication, or through changes in the medical system, in ways that the religious fundamentalist groups are able to take hold of these and to encourage or to develop methods in which they aid civil society and, in a sense, to empower themselves, and as well as to establish a bit of credibility. Stability, again, does not have to mean violence against the regime, nor does it have to mean a violent or a change in regime itself, but, again, a disruption in the harmony between groups or the perceived possibility of violence itself as well.
Thank you very much. So after the break, we'll continue with your stand. Studio audience, please keep your questions coming. There's also a poll ongoing, so let's take a look at which side is providing the more convincing argument right now. There has been quite a significant shift in the number of people who disagree with the motion. Earlier, we had 78.6% who agreed. Currently, only 28.6% agree with the motion. So it's almost a complete reversal of our early results. So we'll be right back. You're watching Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. The motion tonight, religious fundamentalism is a threat to Asia's future. Before the break, we heard from the first speaker from both the proposition and the opposition. Now, the next speaker from the opposition will have 3 minutes to state his case. So, Dr. Farish Ahmad Noor, if you're ready, your 3 minutes begins now.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to take off from where Sean left off earlier on this question of whether religious fundamentalism, as it's been defined today, poses a threat to harmony or stability of any established political order. This reminds me, of course, of the stories of many other alleged radicals and subversives in the past who likewise were accused of trying to change or challenge the established order in order to make the world a better place. And we can add to this list individuals like Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, who during their time also accused of attempting to destabilize society. Now, of course, when we look at the histories of all these religions, religion is there to change the world. It doesn't have to apologize to do that. That's why religion has played such a visible role in the development of Asia. And the relationship between religion and politics, religion and governance, it's not something new in Asia either. It goes back to antiquity. It goes back to the Hindu-Buddhist period of Southeast Asia's history. It goes back to the coming of Islam and Christianity. And we see successive attempts by religious actors to attempt to better society on the basis of an understanding of the fundamentals of their religion. So for me, fundamentalism, a model of fundamentalism would be the iconic image of the Buddhist monk who stands before the tank, before the gun, before the bayonet, in order to make his point, who is prepared to not kill, but die for something he believes in. And we need this in politics, even in the most secular forms of politics. We do believe in things. We believe in democracy. We believe in freedom of speech. So we can never transcend metaphysics in politics. But to go back to Chandra's point earlier, if we look at the history of Southeast Asia, or Asia in general, over the 20th century, these incidents, and we don't deny, of course, that there have been incidents of, pogroms, attacks, religiously inspired violence. The component of politics, and in particular the political economy that seems to be missing from this discussion, has to be taken into account. More often than not, we have seen the phenomenon of radical groups being constructed or funded by what are basically secular political movements, political elites who use politics and use religion in order to further certain sectarian agendas in their society. I think on that point we're not in disagreement here. But I would maintain again the line that Chandra has raised earlier. We need to distinguish the difference between the political abuse and use, the deliberate use of religion as a tool to alienate minorities or attack minorities, and those who genuinely believe in their respective religions to bring about change in society.
Thank you. Now from the proposition, Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, your 3 minutes begins now.
Well, we've heard exercise in sophistry. We've heard that there are many threats in Asia. That among these threats, religious fundamentalism is not one of them because it doesn't count as the main threat. We've heard that religion is there to change the world, and therefore people of great uprightness, whether it be a Gandhi or a Buddha, people who are highly religious in the conventional term, have actually managed to change society. The point is not whether religion has been used or abused. There is a very noble vision of religion, which I'm glad has been articulated. But there is another side to religion. A religion which takes into account bigotry, which takes into account intolerance, which takes into account the complete dismissal of any meaningful role for women in society. These are the real challenges, these are the real movements. Whether they at any point have been instigated by secular movements or not is not the issue. The point is, driven by an innate conviction that they are right. The mentality of the suicide bomber who believes that he is doing the right thing by killing others because he's going to get salvation by killing the enemies of the faith. That is the mentality. And that constitutes a big threat. It is not the only threat to Asia, but it is a threat, as we've insisted. And the future of Asia has lain in the fact that it's been a society which since the last 60 years has grown, benefited from decolonization, created modern states, created modern economies, empowered people, economically has grown, and has given rise to a certain degree of openness. Of course, there are problems with that openness. It's not perfect. But against this, you have this wave of intolerance which is creeping in. I agree it's not probably as great a threat as the nuclear problem. But it is a threat. And as long as we try to disguise the fact that this threat is actually a benign influence or is completely harmless, I think we are doing a greater disservice to Asia, because it's time to stand up to this threat, just as it is important to stand up against environmental degradation or against complete mad nuclear wars.
Thank you. The panelists from both sides have presented convincing arguments. Let's take a look now at the poll and see how it stands. Currently, 60% of you agree with the motion and 40% disagree, so it has swung back in favor of the proposition. We're now going into question time, where we'll be taking some questions from the studio audience who've been sending them in. The audience can also ask questions live by raising their hands. Do we have a question from the floor, please? They would like to ask a question into a microphone to one of our panelists. In that case, let me take an online question while you think about questions you want to ask our panelists directly. So we have a question for the proposition. How far is the religious conflict we see now a mere extension of previously existing ethnic nationalist conflicts in the region and thus not a new threat? Question for the proposition.
Something from Asia, something in Afghanistan, where it's not that existing ethnic conflicts didn't exist. It's because those conflicts have been reshaped, redrawn into a vision of society that is completely regressive, and if I may say so, almost threatens to take an entire country not only back to the Stone Ages, but is a potential threat to the rest of the neighborhood. That, to my mind, symbolizes, perhaps in the most extreme end, what religious fundamentalism can do.
Now, Afghanistan actually strengthens our case. Why? Because if you look at the history of Afghanistan, the rise of the Taliban was largely because of the political situation at that time. They came to power between 1996 and 2001. The Taliban declined in its influence for a number of years, but the moment you had the invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation of Afghanistan, today you find the Taliban has become very popular again. The Taliban is in full control of most of Afghanistan. The rise of the Taliban is a direct consequence of politics, not of religion. It's not because suddenly the people of Afghanistan have become very backward again. This is not the reason. And if you look at the whole history of Afghanistan, again, it reinforces this argument. You had a very secular government in the 60s and 70s. You had a totally different atmosphere. Most of the staff of Kabul University were actually women in the 60s and 70s. What changed this? It was politics. It was geopolitics. The Soviet Union versus the United States of America. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And as a result of that, the situation changed. So let's not divorce politics and economics and the desire for power from religion. Power has played a very big role in shaping religion and the way in which religion is understood and practiced by people.
But Dr. Muzaffar, I did not at all suggest that it was religion. It could well be politics.
You were citing...
No, I was citing Afghanistan as a specific example where religious fundamentalism is a threat. And I think you will not deny that the people there are motivated, the Taliban in particular, are motivated by a very perverse interpretation of religion. These may have been occasioned by secular developments, notably politics, notably the invasion of Afghanistan by the other forces. But the mere fact that it poses a threat cannot be denied. And the origins of the threat we can debate. Well, and I think I would be in agreement with you. But it's the net effect of that threat which we are talking about today.
Let me very quickly, if
sure,
I may,
go ahead.
Mr. Chairperson, say this, that if we want to understand the role of religion and religious extremism or fundamentalism, it is incumbent upon us to analyze the situation in such a way that we understand the rise of this type of thinking. This is what we are trying to say. You're talking for threat. Is it right to say that religious fundamentalism is a threat when you don't want to look at the underlying causes of the rise of that sort of fundamentalism? And Afghanistan is an outstanding example of how that sort of fundamentalism develops.
Just to follow up from Chandra's point again, and to go back to the example of the Taliban, I think the Taliban is a very good example of precisely the connection between this sort of violent, religiously inspired or religiously dressed politics and the political economy. We simply have to refer to the editorials of some of the business newspapers in Europe, in the late 90s when the Taliban took over the capital of Afghanistan after the fall of the Mujahideen, who were quite happy to see the Taliban actually come to power in Afghanistan simply because it was then seen as a restoration of some sort of stability to Afghanistan society, so that the production of oil and gas and commerce can continue. So when we talk about threat to society, I mean, who are we talking about, and I mean, who is under threat here? If we look at the record of the relationship between some of the developed countries in the world and the rest of Asia, we've seen many instances where corporations, governments have had no problems whatsoever in having long-term economic and political relations with countries or governments that are regarded as fundamentalist or extreme. So again, this raises the question that Chandra raised the first time. At what point do these things really constitute a threat, either to that society or to some external, regional or international order?
Well, I think in the case of Afghanistan, it constituted a threat despite the myopia of certain business interests in the region who saw it as a temporary stability. And I think the internal situation in Afghanistan, particularly the degradation of women, which I think is a very, very important fact. It's a basic violation of all forms of civilized existence, of human rights, which took place in Afghanistan. And that movement proved contagious. And I think that's very important to note. It proved contagious in an ideological way. Now, that ideology may have had political imperatives. It could have had, the driving force could have been political. But at the end of the day, you had a people, you had a movement which decided that their strongest appeal lay in the fact that they claimed to be pious, that they feigned piousness. And that was the fact, that was the basic reason why they have influenced not only Afghanistan, but large parts of Pakistan, which are today in a degree of great deal of uncertainty and really poses a threat to the entire region.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have a question from a student from the audience. Yes. Tell us who you are and your question, who you want to direct your question to. Thank you.
I'm Glendon. I'm from Hwa Chong, and I'd like to direct this question to the opposition. I agree with the opposition that most of the time religious fundamentalism is a result of some social economic marginalization or some political causes that are not really related to religion as such. My question to the opposition is then, would the opposition agree that religious fundamentalism lends a voice, a credibility to these socio-economically marginalized groups, meaning that they excite the passions of these groups of people and inspire them to commit, to translate their feelings of resentment and dissatisfaction into concrete action, such as blowing up buildings or something like that?
Thank you very much for that question, because I'd like to use that in order to reiterate the point I made earlier. Let's look at the phenomena of religion, both historically and in terms of religious praxis and how it functions in society. Historically, when you talk about religion giving a voice to the weak or the poor, well, historically we know that, and this is what precisely all the founders or prophets of the various religions that we have in Asia began with in the first place. Prophets do not speak for kings. Prophets do not speak for the rich. Prophets speak precisely for the poor. And this includes the marginalized subaltern communities, including women. And as we've seen in the history of the evolution of religion and religiosity across Asia, this has always been the case. Now, this is why I think it is important to go back to Chandra's point about drawing a distinction between the actions of a tiny minority who have, admittedly, taken a literal interpretation of religious texts, perhaps too far, certainly too far, and with violent consequences on society. So the question for me is this: are we suggesting that simply because some individuals believe wholeheartedly in a single idea, then that in itself represents a threat? No state in the history of governance, I think, can actually intervene in the private subjectivity of an individual and tell someone, convince someone, or force someone to believe in something else. And in a sense, surely we don't want to go down to the path where we deny an individual the right to believe. A Muslim, a Christian, a Buddhist is perfectly entitled to believe in what he or she believes in with commitment. The question for us, I suppose, is when that belief is taken one step further into the public domain and whereby it incurs a political or a security cost on society. That's when I think people in the security domain feel threatened by these developments. But surely faith and religiosity cannot be dismissed outright, because historically it's always been part of the development of society in Asia, and it's played largely a positive role.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to pause you there, gentlemen. We have to go for a quick commercial break, but don't go away. We have plenty of questions from our studio audience. Please keep them coming in. Let's take a quick look at our poll. It currently stands at 31.6% in agreement with the motion and 68.4% in disagreement. Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates will continue in just a short while. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. The motion tonight, religious fundamentalism is a threat to Asia's future. This is question time, where our audience is posing questions to the panelists. We'd now like to take a question from the floor.
My name is Sumana Thera, Singapore Buddhist Federation. I'm very happy to hear the both sides, but I have a little bit doubt when I see the theme, whether we are giving a wrong interpretation to the society in a simple way that religion creating some difficulties to our society when she is a threat. Because as far as I understand, if I say in the Buddhist point of view, Buddhist fundamentals are meant for peace, harmony, based on loving kindness and compassion. Fundamentals. Then we say fundamentalism, this word we understand as something very harmful. So when you add the adjective religious fundamentalism, many people understand from our discussions something in a wrong perspective. Are we mixing up those valuable, invaluable fundamentals of our religions?
I completely agree with the questioner from the floor earlier, that we need to distinguish between the fundamentals of religion and what we call the phenomenon of religious fundamentalism. Now, as for the latter, the term religious fundamentalism, we'll note, came into use in the 20th century, and it has always had a sort of loaded political connotation to it, and it's always seen as something pejorative. And I think this was particularly the case from the 1970s onwards, when the phenomena of religious mobilization was seen as threatening to certain political regimes or established patterns or networks or constellations of power. So on that note, let us try to imagine having a debate like this, perhaps in the first century, and you could imagine a debate along with the title, "Is Jesus Christ a threat to the Roman Empire?" And that has always been, I think, the reaction of entrenched political economic elites to forces that want to bring about change in society. I completely agree with the proposers who state that there are instances where certain individuals have literally taken the meaning of certain religious scriptures or edicts too far. But going back to the point earlier, certain fundamentals can only offer us a literal interpretation anyway. How else do we interpret an edict like "thou shalt not kill"? There is only a literal fundamental interpretation of that. Now, the problem of those who use and abuse religious texts is not unique to any religion, nor is it a new phenomena. It goes back throughout the history of all the religious communities of the world. I think what we are seeing in Asia, however, is a very unhealthy conjunction of, on the one hand, individuals like that who are prepared to use and abuse religion for their political ends, and more importantly, political actors and agents who are more than happy to use and exploit such individuals to their ends. If you look at the region as a whole, many of these radical violent groups, are recruited from basically the poorer sections of society, not exactly the most pious or religious of individuals themselves, and B, more often than not, the acts of violence that they commit also fulfill certain political and ideological agendas of other interested groups that are actually behind the scenes. Now, this is the thing that we need to disentangle in Southeast Asia and in Asia as a whole. So to go back very quickly to the question before that, where's the role of religion in politics? My worry is religion being hijacked by politics. If there is a role that religion has to play, it is as a check to power. Religion is there to check the excesses of power.
Thank you very much. I do need to take another question from the floor. There was a lady in the second row. Yes, ma'am? Thank you for waiting. I'm sorry to make you wait so long. If you could please tell us your name and, as succinct as you can, your question, please.
Okay. Shanti D'Souza from the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Various states have been using religion as a factor in their policy, in their foreign policy and domestic policy. How do you prevent states from doing that? The second is, how do you prevent radicalization spreading? At the grassroots level, there are conditions which could be economic and political. People do feel marginalized and alienated. How do you actually bring them back to the fold, that they do not use religion or get into an extreme interpretation of religion which takes them the other way?
I'd like to begin with the opposition, please. Yes.
Thank you, Chairperson. Now, my simple answer to this question would be resolve some of the fundamental challenges that confront many of these societies. You just take a few examples from this region. You look at the Philippines. We have had this long-standing problem of the Moros, their struggle for liberation. Now, at the beginning, the Moro liberation movement was secular. It has now become very religious. And what is the reason? It's partly because there's been no solution. After so many decades, people feel very frustrated. They lose faith in that sort of secular leadership and turn to a religious leadership, thinking that it's partly because we've had this secular leadership that we have not been able to solve problems of this sort. They've betrayed us, so they become more religious. And the Moro liberation movement and the stages it has gone through is not the only example. You look at what has happened in the case of Palestine. At the beginning, the Palestinian liberation movement was secular. And today, the main actor in the Palestinian struggle is a religious movement. And here again, you see the same sort of development. And going back to Afghanistan, the only reason why the Taliban is able to control so much of Afghanistan today is because there is occupation. So when you ask, what are the solutions? Stand up against occupation. Stand up against the conquest of other people's territories. Stand up against imperialism and the injustices that emanate from that. Stand up against corruption and bad governance in your own society, because these are the things which feed into narrow, extremist, bigoted thinking.
Thank you.
Where does religion end and where does secularism or modern governance begin? What happens if religion and imperatives of governance are in conflict? And I think that brings us to Farish's question of thou shalt not kill. Now, most Christian societies have been guilty of gross violation of that dictum. And I think you'll find that just as thou shalt not kill exists in the New Testament, you'll find that in the Old Testament there are more blood-curdling noises which are made. Likewise, I think in most religions it becomes a war of quotes. If you quote one thing, you'll find somewhere else in the scriptures something else which is in direct conflict with it. So the question sometimes is not whether we follow the fundamentals of religion, or the question never arises into an abstruse theological debate as to what exactly are the fundamentals. It's sometimes important to allow modern values, common sense, prevailing values. People change. And likewise, we must use our conventional morality of the period to ascertain what is right and what is wrong. Sometimes they may be in harmony with religion, and sometimes they may not be in harmony.
Thank you. I do have to take one more question from the floor. I know that there's someone in the first row who has a burning desire to ask this last question from the floor. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
Thank you. Navin from the National University of Singapore. My question is to the proposition. I wanted to ask if there was anything particularly special about Asia that makes it vulnerable to religious fundamentalism.
Yes, I think in Asia, and I specifically in Southeast Asia, for example, these pluralistic societies that you have, and the advent or the coming of democracy and secularization to these countries, Indonesia being a prime example, Malaysia as well. The inability of the state, for example, in Indonesia, has been unable to provide some of the basic services, which provides the political space or the entry point for some of these fundamentalist groups to take hold. So when you look at a region such as Asia, or more particularly to a region such as Southeast Asia, there arises this threat of the relative newness of democracy, as well as the relative inability of states, Indonesia, for example, because of its sheer size, to be able to provide the basic services that are needed. And this creates an opportunity, especially amongst the poor, for example, or the uneducated, I'm sorry, not the uneducated, but the undereducated, to look for alternative routes to prosperity, to look to alternative routes for success. And this is where these fundamentalist groups come into play, because in Southeast Asia, for example, religion does play a major role, not just in an individual's personal life, but in society and government as well. So there's this opening in this space due to the relative immaturity of democracy, the relative newness of society in Southeast Asia in particular.
Thank you. Let's have a look at how the poll stands right now at the moment. We have 39.1% who agree and 60.9% who disagree with the motion. After the break, we'll come back in time for the final word. Our panelists will be given 1 minute each to give their final arguments. That's after this short break. Stay tuned to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. The motion tonight, religious fundamentalism is a threat to Asia's future. We're now entering the endgame after a fascinating battle of minds. It's now time for final word. I would request each speaker to sum up in 1 minute what his final thoughts are. We'll begin with the proposition. Mr. Sean Levine, if you're ready, your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, one has to come to a firm understanding or an agreement to what is the threat. Is the threat the change of regimes? Is the threat the violent reaction of fundamentalist groups or counter movements to the fundamentalist groups? Or is the threat the inability of the state to provide basic services to the people in which they look outside of the state to find answers and to find solutions? And the threat being that economic stability, prosperity of a country are all tied into one when there's an opportunity for a fundamentalist group or a movement to take advantage of the state's inability to provide services. And this draws itself also into foreign investment, into the ability for domestic investment and economic stability. So the real threat, of course, there are bigger threats in Asia than fundamentalism, but the inability of states to provide services to their people is the biggest threat because it drives people into these fundamentalist groups looking for answers.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. And now, from the opposition, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. We have to accept this reality that religion in Asia will always be part of the public sphere. And religion is important because it gives us a sense of who we are and why we are here. But equally important, it furnishes us with fundamental values and principles of living. And I would argue that at this stage in our history, these values are very, very important. Why? Because we are faced with a monumental economic crisis, an energy crisis, an environmental crisis, and values such as caring for the other, sharing with others, thinking beyond oneself, taming our greed. These are fundamental values, and they're needed today more than ever before. And this I see as the role of religion. Now, if that sort of articulation of religion becomes more prominent, we don't have to worry about the fringe groups and their extremist views. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now over to the proposition, Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. Your 1 minute begins now.
You know, Karl Marx was a classic Enlightenment philosopher, a rationalist. But between Karl Marx and Pol Pot, there is only the color red, which is similar. Nothing else is similar. But yet they claim the same genealogy. I think that's true for religions, classical religions, and say the Taliban. But yet, the Taliban poses a threat, and classical religion does not pose a threat. The question is really, what is Asia's future? Is Asia's future going to be dictated by what people see as the 21st century being the Asian century, where we are able to take advantage of the shortcomings, the changes, and exploit it and use it to our advantage and create an open society that is more prosperous? Or do we regress into a divisive mode and create further divisions? That's really the question. That's why this is a threat.
Thank you very much. And now to our final speaker from the opposition, Dr. Farish Ahmad Noor. Your 1 minute begins now.
Thank you. On the subject of the possible Talibanization of Asia, let us remind ourselves again that the Taliban were not a natural phenomenon. They were a constructed phenomenon. And the fact that they were allowed to arise demonstrates precisely the connection between perverted religion, abused religion on the one hand, and the agenda of politics and economics. I think there is almost no way that any state can prevent people from having differences in beliefs. And that, for me, has never been the issue. As Chandra has noted earlier, the acts of violence committed by a tiny minority should not be made to stand for the religious community as a whole. But my worry, as far as the future of Asia is concerned, is whether we have blown up the seeming threat of fundamentalism to basically open the way for the rise of a security state that really is the real threat to fundamental liberties.
Thank you very much. You've heard from all our panelists. They've had their say. Now you have yours. Studio audience, please cast your votes now. Choose if you agree or disagree with the motion. You have 1 minute. Please cast your votes. The votes are in and the audience has decided. Now, at the start of this debate, 78.6% of our audience members had polled for the motion and 21.4% polled against. Let's take a look at the final tally. Have our panelists been able to sway the audience? The final tally is 41.7% agree with the motion and 58.3% have polled against the motion. So the winner is the opposition. Congratulations to Professor Chandra Muzaffar and Dr. Farish Ahmad Noor. You have also convinced our audience that religious fundamentalism is not a threat to Asia's future. Congratulations. Well done. Mr. Sean Levine and Dr. Swapan Dasgupta, thank you very much for taking part in Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. It was a very close fight this round. You've also put forward very compelling arguments. Thank you for being here. Well done. Religious fundamentalism. What is this gigantic spectre that is haunting the entire world? This extremely lively and captivating debate has established one point very, very clearly. Religious fundamentalism is not merely confined to one particular faith, but is common to all religions in varying depths and intensities. Let me thank our distinguished panelists, also our studio audience and our viewers for taking part in this debate. Find out more information on the debates and make your stand on today's motion by visiting our website, which is channelnewsasia.com/Bridging Asia. Thank you and good night.